You finally have $1 million. So why are you still afraid to quit? Daniel thought that number would feel like freedom. Instead, it exposed something far more uncomfortable. He had spent 20 years building a life he was too afraid to leave. At 24, Daniel had almost nothing. His checking account rarely stayed above 4 digits. Rent arrived before payday. A car repair could turn into a week of calculations. He knew which groceries were cheaper, which bills could wait 3 days, and exactly how much money had to survive until Friday. He hated that life. So he made himself a promise. One day, he would have enough money that nobody could scare him with money again. That sentence became his private religion. Every raise went into the plan. Every bonus had a destination. Friends upgraded their cars, Daniel kept his. Co-workers booked expensive vacations, Daniel stayed home. When his salary doubled, his lifestyle barely moved. At 30, he had $94,000 invested. At 35, $287,000. At 41, he crossed $700,000. Then, at 47, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the number finally appeared on his screen. $1,006,318. Daniel stared at it. This was supposed to be the moment. The bills were covered. The mortgage was nearly gone. His investments were compounding. His children were old enough that they no longer needed him every second. He had won the game he had spent half his life playing. And yet, at 8:17 that morning, he opened his work email. 14 messages were waiting. He answered all of them. That is the first thing nobody tells you about financial freedom. Getting the money is only half the problem. The harder question is what happens when you finally have enough, and discover that your habits, your fears, and your identity never received the memo. If this story already feels uncomfortably familiar, stay with it. And if you want more stories that turn money into something bigger than numbers, hit like, subscribe, and tell me one number you believe would finally make you feel free. Because Daniel's number was 1 million. Yours might be completely different. 3 weeks later, Daniel's boss called him into a glass conference room. "We're restructuring," she said. His position was being eliminated. For years, Daniel had imagined those words as a disaster. Now he simply sat there. His severance was coming. His investments were still growing. His family wasn't facing eviction. Nobody was going hungry. He could leave. He could actually leave. But his first thought wasn't relief. It was, what am I going to do? That question followed him all the way home. His wife was waiting in the kitchen. "You got fired." "Technically, they eliminated my position." She studied his face. "Are you okay?" Daniel nodded. Then she asked the question he had spent years avoiding. "Do you want another job?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because suddenly, the $1 million was no longer a trophy. It was a mirror. For 23 years, Daniel had told himself he was working for freedom. But if freedom had arrived, and he was still terrified to use it, what exactly had he been building? That night, he walked into his home office. 2 monitors. A leather chair. Stacks of financial statements. A spreadsheet tracking every investment. And on the wall, a handwritten target from years earlier. $1 million, then we're free. Daniel looked at the sentence for a long time. Then he noticed something he had never noticed before. He had reached the number. But he had never written what came after it. Because the moment you no longer need money to survive, money stops being the question. The question becomes what you're willing to do with your time. And Daniel was about to discover that those two things are not remotely the same. The next morning, Daniel did something he had never allowed himself to do. He stayed home. No alarm. No commute. No laptop bag by the door. At 9:12, he was standing in the kitchen with coffee in his hand, watching sunlight move across the counter. For 23 years, 9:12 meant he was already late for something. Now he had nowhere to be. And strangely, that freedom made him uncomfortable. By 10 o'clock, he had checked his portfolio twice. By 10:30, he had opened LinkedIn. By 11:15, he was reading job listings. Not because he needed a job. Because he needed the feeling of being needed. That distinction would cost him months. Daniel applied for a senior position that paid $240,000. The recruiter called the next afternoon. "You're a strong candidate," she said. "Why are you looking?" Daniel paused. He could have said he wanted a challenge. He could have said he enjoyed the industry. Instead, he told the truth. "I've been doing this for a long time." There was silence. Then she asked, "So you're looking for something different?" Daniel looked through the window at his backyard. "No," he said. "I think I'm looking for something familiar." That sentence stayed with him. Because money had given him an exit. But his identity kept pointing him back toward the building he had just escaped. This is where financial freedom becomes psychologically complicated. When you're broke, money gives you things you genuinely need: food, shelter, stability, time to recover from emergencies. When you're comfortable, money gives you choices. But after a certain point, money stops solving problems and starts revealing them. You can buy the house. Then you have to decide why you live there. You can leave the job. Then you have to decide who you are without the title. You can afford the vacation. Then you have to confront why you kept postponing it. Daniel had spent decades answering one question. How much is enough? He had never asked the more dangerous one. Enough for what? A month passed. Then another. His financial advisor called him for their quarterly review. The numbers looked excellent. Portfolio up. Debt down. Cash reserve strong. Projected retirement income more than sufficient. The advisor smiled. "You're in a very strong position." Daniel smiled back. He should have felt proud. Instead, he asked, "So what am I supposed to do now?" The advisor laughed. "Whatever you want." Daniel nodded. But that answer terrified him more than losing his job had. Because, whatever you want sounds like freedom until you realize how little time you have spent discovering what you actually want. And Daniel wasn't the only one changing. His wife had started noticing something else. He was home more. But he wasn't present. He sat at breakfast while checking market futures. He took his daughter to school while listening to investment podcasts. He went on walks, but turned them into phone calls. He had removed work from his calendar without removing work from his mind. One evening, his wife found him at the dining table surrounded by spreadsheets. "You know you don't have to do this anymore," she said. Daniel didn't look up. "I know. No. I don't think you do." He finally raised his eyes. She pointed at the screen. "You keep protecting a life you don't even want." That landed harder than any financial loss could have. Because Daniel suddenly understood the trap. He had thought wealth was about having enough assets that nothing could take his life away. But there was another way to lose your life. You could spend it protecting the future from every possible risk until there was nothing left of the present. The next morning, Daniel made a decision. He wasn't going to quit working forever. He was going to quit working from fear. That sounded simple. It wasn't. He had to decide how much money was actually enough to support his family. How much he could safely spend each year. What he wanted his days to look like. Which obligations were necessary. Which were inherited. And which were simply habits wearing the costume of responsibility. For the first time, Daniel stopped asking his spreadsheet for permission. He began asking himself. And that changed the entire calculation. Because once you stop measuring wealth by the size of your account, another balance sheet appears. Hours with your children. Mornings without an alarm. People you can call. Places you can go. Things you can refuse. And time you will never get back. Daniel had spent 23 years maximizing the first balance sheet. Now he was about to find out what the second one was worth. 6 months after losing his job, Daniel sold the car he had driven for 11 years. It wasn't an expensive car. That was the point. He had bought it when he was 36, when every dollar still had a job. He had maintained it perfectly, changed the oil early, replaced anything before it broke. Selling it felt strangely emotional. Not because he loved the car. Because it represented the person he had been when he bought it. The man who believed that if he worked hard enough, saved enough, and controlled enough, nothing could ever take his future away. Daniel had finally learned the flaw in that plan. You can protect your future so aggressively that you accidentally spend your entire present protecting it. So he made smaller changes first. He stopped checking his portfolio every morning. He took Wednesdays off. He started picking his daughter up from school. He booked the trip to Italy his wife had mentioned years earlier. Not for 2 weeks. 4 or 5. The first few days were uncomfortable. Daniel kept thinking about what he wasn't doing. The emails he wasn't answering. The meetings he wasn't attending. The money he wasn't earning. Then, somewhere between Florence and Rome, something changed. His daughter asked him, "Dad, why didn't we do this before?" Daniel looked at her. He could have explained interest rates, career progression, school schedules, market returns. Instead, he said, "I thought we couldn't." She shrugged. "Could we?" Daniel smiled. Yes. That was the moment the $1 million finally became useful. Not because the number went up. Because for once, the number went down, and his life got bigger. And that is the part people misunderstand about wealth. We often imagine financial freedom as accumulation. More money. More assets. More investments. More security. But eventually, the question changes. At some point, the purpose of wealth isn't to make your number larger. It's to make your life larger. Daniel still invested. He still watched his spending. He still cared about protecting his family's future. He hadn't suddenly become reckless. He had simply stopped confusing caution with wisdom. Because there is a difference between being financially responsible and being financially afraid. Responsible people protect tomorrow. Afraid people sacrifice today to protect a tomorrow that may never arrive. And the line between the two can be almost invisible. That's why someone with $50,000 can sometimes feel freer than someone with $5 million. Not because $50,000 is more money. Because freedom was never stored entirely inside the account. It was stored in the distance between what you have and what you are afraid to lose. Daniel's old life had been built around one sentence. What if something goes wrong? His new life began with another. What if everything is already enough? That question didn't make him careless. It made him selective. He didn't need to prove himself with another promotion. He didn't need the bigger house. He didn't need another decade of telling his family, "We'll do it later." He had spent years trying to buy freedom. Then he realized freedom wasn't something money could hand him. Money could only create the room for him to choose it. And choice has a price too. You have to disappoint people. You have to leave opportunities behind. You have to accept that your career might peak earlier than someone else's. You have to stop explaining every decision through money. Most difficult of all, you have to accept that nobody is coming to tell you when you've accumulated enough. There is no bank statement that says, "You may begin living now." No investment account sends a notification. "Congratulations. Your life can start." You decide. That was Daniel's real retirement. Not the day he stopped working. The day he stopped postponing. Years later, the $1 million was no longer the number he remembered most. He remembered a Tuesday morning. A quiet kitchen. A cup of coffee. No alarm. No meeting. No one waiting for him to prove that he deserved to be there. He had once believed financial freedom meant never worrying about money again. Now he understood something deeper. You can have enough money and still live like you're broke. You can have millions and remain psychologically employed. You can own your time on paper and still give every hour away. And you can spend your entire life building a fortress around a future that never actually arrives. The real question was never, "How much money do I need to feel free?" It was, "How much of my life am I willing to trade before I finally use the freedom I've already bought?" Because eventually, the number stops being the story. You do. And if you wait until you feel completely safe before you start living, you may discover something money cannot fix. You can recover lost money. You cannot compound lost time.